less dense air, has the same effects on an airframe as 369 knots at sea level in more dense air on a standard day. Big difference at low altitude versus higher altitudes for the same pressure acting on the airframe. As you can see, this is why Boeing derives two airspeed limitations, one in terms of knots, the other in terms of Mach number. Notice the similarity? Again, according to the NTSB, the alleged United 175, reported as a 767, reached a speed of 510 knots. An experiment was allegedly performed in a 767 simulator to observe if such an aircraft can obtain United 175 reported speeds at low altitude. We say allegedly as no information was given to confirm such an experiment took place. However, they claim they were able to accelerate the simulator to 0.86 Mach at 2,000 feet, which is 568 knots for this altitude on a standard day. They claim the simulator was relatively easy to control at such speeds, and their conclusion was, it is highly probable that American 11 and United 175 could easily make the airspeeds quoted in the official reports and as seen in the video footage. They also make the claim 0.86 is the max operating speed for all altitudes, ignoring max operating speed set as 360 knots by Boeing for lower altitudes. Again, what they fail to realize are the effects of air density at high altitudes compared to low, and the reason Boeing assigns two types of airspeed for max operating limits. 0.86 Mach, 568 knots at low altitude has the same effect on an aircraft as 805 knots or 1.32 Mach at 22,000 feet on a standard day. The researchers who have made such claims based on their alleged simulator experience may want to inform Boeing that their 767s can obtain supersonic Concorde type speeds in a quote flat trajectory and be relatively easy to control in mid-level altitudes. This is what happens when you exceed such maximum operating limits set by the manufacturer. Granted, there is a safety margin built into the maximum operating limits, but there is a reason limits are assigned to aircraft, as you can see here.
In the slow XL 85.
Terminate. Knock it off. We lost it.
Since there are such margins of safety built into such limits, and Boeing has not been very cooperative to share wind tunnel data in order to determine when the aircraft start to break up in flight, we do have data to use as a benchmark from the National Transportation Safety Board. Again, according to the NTSB, Egypt Air 990 reached 0.99 Mach at 22,000 feet as its peak speed in a dive. 0.99 Mach is 603 knots at 22,000 feet, and its equivalent airspeed is roughly 425 knots at or near sea level. This is only 65 knots over VMO. Again, according to the NTSB, United 175, the aircraft which allegedly struck the South Tower, reached a speed of 510 knots. 150 knots over its max operating, and the equivalent of 85 knots, that of Egypt Air 990. Using Egypt Air 990 as precedent, it is impossible for the alleged United 175 to reach 510 knots, period. Let's see if United 175 could have continued control flight at such a speed. Remember, those who conducted the alleged simulator tests claimed that the aircraft was relatively easy to control at 0.86 Mach near sea level. According to the NTSB and reports, Egypt Air 990 had two significant debris fields telling us the aircraft broke up in flight. I think we'll all agree that the aircraft which suffers structural failure in flight is difficult to control. But at which time in flight did this occur? The best indication we have right now is based on electrical power loss. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder stopped recording a few seconds after peak speed, as did the transponder which failed, indicating loss of power. The NTSB speculates loss of power to FDR and CVR due to the engines being shut down, but this isn't valid. The FDR and CVR do not automatically lose power when the engines are shut down. The FDR and CVR are essential items and have redundant systems for power in the event of an engine shutdown. Also, the ATC transponder power loss would not occur with the engines being shut down. Power loss to multiple essential items indicates when the airframe started to bend or break up in flight, enough to cause the power loss of all essential and standby power systems. Again, the equivalent of only 65 knots over its max operating limit. We now know an unmodified 767 cannot reach speeds reported for the South Tower strike, but it's also impossible for United 175, an unmodified 767, to have continued controlled flight at 150 plus knots over its max operating limit, according to precedent set by EgyptAir 990. So, if this isn't a stock 767, what is it? Was it a modified, beefed-up 767 to obtain such incredible speeds? If so, did 19 Islamic extremists do the modifications in their caves in Afghanistan? The only other possibility here is that the NTSB data for EgyptAir 990 is false, combined with the NTSB calculated radar study for United 175 is also false. If you believe this to be the case, this has grave ramifications for flight safety, and you should think twice about getting on your next flight. Clearly, the simulator used in the reported experiment, if in fact such an experiment was performed, as it's only hearsay at this point, was not calibrated with any type of crash logic and allowed speeds equivalent of breaking the sound barrier for a 767 in mid-level altitudes. It's interesting to note the individuals who conducted the simulator experiment also claim the destructive speed for a 76 or 757, as stated by Boeing, at sea level, is approximately 420 knots. This is consistent with EgyptAir 990 power loss when calculating equivalent airspeed. Yet the researchers also claim the aircraft was easy to control at more than 150 knots over max operating. Do these people even understand their own research? Apparently not. Cockpit simulators are not meant for simulating aerodynamic stress on an aircraft. Cockpit simulators are meant for practicing profiles and emergency procedures for pilots. For example, there is no possible way to precisely simulate the effects of real-world G-loads in a cockpit simulator. You're always at 1G. For aerodynamic stress, wind tunnels are utilized for more accurate simulation and measurements. Using a cockpit simulator to measure aerodynamic stress is like using a compass to determine your altitude. Pilots, when training in simulators, practice profiles well within the limits of the aircraft. There is no reason for an airline to train pilots outside the aircraft envelope, as pilots are trained to keep the aircraft well within its limitations. The reason for crash logic not operating on a simulator could be numerous, with the leading candidate most likely being cost. But it is also interesting to note the simulator researchers claim to have pulled the overspeed circuit breakers so they wouldn't be annoyed by the overspeed warnings. Did the researchers unknowingly pull the crash logic for overspeed on the simulator? It appears so. Now, one could argue that the speed reported for United 175 was a ground speed, and that you cannot compare a ground speed to an airspeed. This certainly is a valid argument, and perhaps would be a good argument if the winds were out of the south at almost 90 knots, giving United 175 a push to the South Tower. But the fact is the winds were mainly from the north, northwest, and light. If anything, the airspeed of the target which was observed impacting the South Tower was more than the ground speed, making it even more unlikely it was an unmodified 767 or United 175. Now for the real eye-opener, as we check United 175 reported low altitude speeds as the equivalent Mach number at altitude. Again, the airspeed which was reported for United 175 is 510 knots near sea level. At 22,000 feet, the speed needed for the same effects on the airframe is 722 knots, or Mach 1.19. Again, I guess Boeing builds 767s capable of supersonic flight at altitude and still controllable to hit a 208-foot wide target with a 25-foot margin for error. American 11, the aircraft which was reported to have impacted the North Tower, was traveling at a lower speed according to the NTSB. The speed reported for American 11 is right on the edge of in-flight structural failure using EgyptAir 990 as precedent.